Hi, and so the news has broken today that tanking threat is going to be nerfed in Battle for Azeroth. And there's a load of people saying the sky is falling, threat's going to be a thing again, harking back to days of yore. But it's absolute nonsense. I'm going to go through the simple maths of the matter, and you'll see that in practical terms, it's really not going to make any difference at all. So, tanking threat at the moment in Legion means that tanks generate 10 times threat. Now, here's me on Covenant moment as a DPS trying to tank a boss here. And I'm frantically trying to generate as much damage as I can because I need to get them fairly close so the useless frost mages can cleave. Their cleave range is really short, it seems. But also that the tank, who's on the other one, the actual proper tanks, don't rip aggro off me with a little swipe or thrash or anything at all that's AoE, because they are generating 10 times threat. As a melee, in order for me to pull aggro off a tank, I need to generate 110% threat, so 10% more than is on the target at the time. So it's actually a bit of a pain, tanks having a massive amount of threat really for this particular really niche situation. So what's happening in Battle for Azeroth is it's going to be reduced to 4 times as much. So let's have a look at that. That sounds like a big nerf, and so you can imagine how people who either don't understand how threat works or just haven't taken the time to spend 5 minutes thinking about it, they'd rather spend 5 minutes just talking rubbish about it, will think, oh no, that means threat's going to be a big thing, DPS are going to be pulling aggro off tanks and all the rest of it. But it's not actually true. So tanks generate with BfA 4 times threat. As a melee, I need to generate 110% of the target's threat to pull aggro off it. So in essence, a tank is fine as long as I don't do 4.4 times as much damage as they do. And that's for melee, bear in mind. Ranged have to generate slightly more threat because the further you are away, the less threat effectively you are to the mob. So that basically means a tank is fine as long as they're doing at least 23% of the best damage dealer's DPS at that time. So obviously there's different portions of a fight we need to think about, but more about that in a moment. So what do tanks typically do? Well, it's easy to check this yourself. You can just go into a raid in your guild raid logs or whatever you've got and have a look at the damage the tanks are doing compared to your top DPS. And what you generally find is that tanks generate anything between a third to a half of the DPS of the best damage dealers. It depends on the fight, it depends on the tank. Some tanks generate more damage than others on certain types of fight, but you can generally rely upon even a tank not doing that much damage on doing about a third of your top damage dealers damage. So that's easy then, because at most you're talking about a damage dealer doing 3 times as much damage as the tank. Well, that damage dealer has to do 4.4 times as much to pull aggro. So in practical terms, it's not going to make any difference. So let's think about the situations under which any sort of balance of threat is important and have a look if it could make a difference. So obviously on the pull, DPS expect, and have done for many years now, to be able to pop their pre-pop, pop their cooldowns as soon as possible. When a mob is being pulled, there was a time when you used to think, does the tank have aggro? You don't even ask that question anymore. You assume the tank's going to get aggro. So you have to think about burst DPS. So again, it's the same thing. Is your burst DPS more than 4.4 times as much as the tank's burst DPS on the pull? Again, generally not. Right? That's the only issue you might have to think about. So thinking about situations where threat could be lost even in Legion, there's 3 basic situations. And of course, the situation there would be exacerbated, be much worse. One, a situation, so tank grabs a pack in a dungeon, say. There's one particular mob to focus down. That's the most dangerous mob, or the one with the highest health, whatever it happens to be that means that you want to kill that mob first. The tank will focus most of their damage on that. They will passively attract the other mobs onto them as well with their AoE abilities. Occasionally they may cycle around them and whatever, it depends on the type of tank. Now in a situation like that, let's say a DPS goes full burst on those mobs, but instead of targeting the one that should go down first, they just target a random one. Now that might be one that the tank is only passively generating threat on with their AoE. In a situation like that, sure, a DPS could pull aggro, but they could do that now. It's much more likely, of course, with the BfA changes. But that's a situation of the DPS not targeting the agreed mob, or it not being clear which one should be targeted. Although that being said, it's usually fairly clear, because ultimately the way this works is the tank targets a mob that should be the focus target. You don't even need symbols on it. You know, you can target of targets. You can basically focus the tank. Press F is usually the default one there to assist the tank, and then you get their target anyway. So that's an easy one. That's just someone not really knowing how to play the game. Second situation is one in which there's a huge gear disparity. So extreme case, you've got someone who is currently in mythic gear from Mythic Antorus, and they're going along to a heroic dungeon, say, where there might be someone of much lower gear, or it might even be a normal Antorus where you've got a tank who's barely got enough gear to do it. They've got enough gear, it's sort of okay. In a situation like that, you might conceivably pull aggro if you go full burst right at the start. Again, that's a situation that could arrive in theory in Legion, and the difference in item level that would be needed between these two would be less in BfA, because, you know, that has been nerfed. But in a group of people that have got, doesn't have to be the same item level, but within a reasonable range that might be expected of people doing the same level of content, again, that shouldn't be an issue. You should be able to do, as a tank, plenty of DPS compared to the top DPSer to be able to maintain aggro. So then the third situation is skittish, of course. Now, just like threat, there's a lot of people don't really understand how skittish works. The way skittish works is you basically get an 80% threat reduction. The tank gets an 80% threat reduction. So they're basically, at the moment, because they do 10 times threat, that means they're only now doing 2 times threat. So, but DPS, remember, they'll pull it off if they do 1 point or 110%. So that means the tank now has to do, or they can't afford for the DPS to do 2.2 times as much damage as them. Well, that is actually the sort of thing DPS do. You know, some tanks, sure, may well be able to maintain roughly half the damage of a good DPS at certain times, but consistently they're not likely to do that. It's likely to be a bit less. So at that point, that's why in skittish, of course, you pull aggro quite a lot unless you tone down your damage. Now, that situation will get worse. Of course it will, because now that tank is going to be generating, instead of like the 200% threat, or 400% threat, I should say, or 200% with skittish in Legion, it's now going to be 80% threat. They're going to be dealing 0.8 times threat. Now, that is straight up less than the DPS, even if they manage to do as much damage as the DPS, which of course they're not going to do. So in that particular situation, yes, it's going to make it worse technically, but you could argue if everyone was just behaving normally, the DPS were guaranteed to pull threat anyway. So you're going from guaranteed to pull threat to guaranteed to pull threat. So in realistic situations, it's not going to be much different. It is, of course, much more difficult for the DPS to tone down their damage and still do enough damage to kill the mobs in a reasonable time. So yeah, skittish, if you think about it, is going to be significantly worse unless they change how skittish works. It might well be that they decide to moderate skittish by, instead of having it as an 80% damage reduction, maybe they just do it as a 50% damage reduction or something like that to achieve a similar effect. But that's really it in terms of threat. So when it comes to your raids, you still shouldn't have a problem. When it comes to, you know, normal behavior in dungeons with people that you're familiar with at the right gear level, it doesn't have to be the same gear level as you should again still be fine. You should be fine in every realistic situation. The fact of the matter is that tanks shouldn't have needed 10 times threat to be able to hold aggro as it is. So yeah, there shouldn't really be anything really to fear other than us as a skittish, but skittish is something to fear anyway. So if you've got any further questions, don't forget to ask below, and I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you found it useful. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe and share for further content. And until next time, I'll see you later.